Good day. Today is Tuesday, 9th September 2025, and the big news this morning, at least the big news in Europe, is the collapse that took place yesterday in the French Parliament of the French government. The French Prime Minister, Monsieur Bayrou, proposed his budget. The budget was rejected by the Parliament. The government made the budget an issue of confidence, and it seems that Monsieur Bayrou is going to resign today. The vote was clear and decisive. There is no question about its outcome, and the Parliament is clearly now strongly repudiating the policies, not just of Monsieur Bayrou himself, but of the person who appointed him, who is, of course, President Macron of France. Now, in certain earlier programs, I suggested that in a state of emergency, the President of France can rule France by decree. I understand that this is not exactly the case. It seems that the President does have very extensive powers under the Constitution of the Fifth Republic and can pass budgets on an emergency basis, but even then, parliamentary approval must eventually be sought. Well, it doesn't seem to me as if Macron has the political space or the political authority in France anymore to do anything of that kind. So he is basically down to three options. Option one is to accept the vote, appoint a new Prime Minister, ask that new Prime Minister to come up with a different budget, and hope that this time the French Parliament will agree to pass the budget. Option two is to dissolve the Parliament and call new parliamentary elections, hoping that this time the outcome will be more decisive than was the case in the election that took place last summer. Option three is for President Macron himself to resign, accepting the reality that as a result of his endless intrigues and maneuvers and the continuous missteps that he has made, France is becoming increasingly ungovernable. The situation of the financial markets for France is deteriorating. The economy is in a deepening hole, and that he, Macron himself, is the proximate, not the underlying, but the proximate cause of France's deteriorating circumstances. Now, this demand that Macron resign has actually been made by one of the smaller parties in the French Parliament, and they are correctly saying that Macron is the major destabilizing factor in France today. Unfortunately, it seems that Mr. Macron, entirely unsurprisingly, is not going to heed this advice. This small party is apparently now proposing that in light of Macron's intransigence and his determination to stay on, that impeachment proceedings be brought against him. But again, without being an expert in the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, I understand that this is an extraordinarily complex process in France, and nobody apparently seriously believes that it can succeed. So we're down to one of the other two options: either appoint a new Prime Minister or call new parliamentary elections. The National Rally, Marine Le Pen's party, wants new parliamentary elections. And in some ways, given that Macron himself won't go, that would be the logical way forward. But Macron seems determined to rule that out. I remember last year when he called elections, when he didn't need to, by the way, he called elections after Le Pen's party, the National Rally, did well in European Parliament elections and hoped that by calling elections actual parliamentary elections in France, he would be able to mobilize French opinion in some kind of reaction against the apparent success of the National Rally, induce what he called a clarifying moment in French politics. Anyway, what happened then was that, of course, there was a complicated outcome in which the National Rally actually did very well in terms of share of the vote, and which led to the broken and dysfunctional parliament that we have today. Anyway, it was then suggested that Macron would wait a year and then call elections again, saying that the parliament was dysfunctional, that it was broken, that France needed a new, strong parliament to carry through reforms and to govern the country, and that was Macron's ultimate game plan. Well, it hasn't worked out that way, because the opinion polls show that if there was a parliamentary election today, the most likely outcome, in fact the overwhelmingly likely outcome, would be a runaway victory for the National Rally, for Marine Le Pen's party, and that, of course, is precisely what Macron doesn't want. So it seems that he is ruling out the option of new parliamentary elections. That leaves only one option left, and that is appointing a new prime minister. He says he already has someone in mind. That new prime minister then proposes a new budget, and the whole circus repeats itself, because it's difficult to imagine that any budget presented to the parliament by an ally of Macron would be acceptable to the parliament unless it was such a desiccated administrative, technical budget that there was no real strong political objection to it, which would, of course, in the short term, perhaps enable the budget to be passed and enable the political temperature to fall a little, but which would leave France's structural problems, which are acknowledged by everyone, unresolved and festering and likely to grow worse. Now, I'm going to say here what I personally think. I think the reason I personally believe that Macron ought to go is because, in my opinion, he has been a profoundly destabilizing factor in modern French politics. He became president in the first place on a completely false premise. It appeared at the time when he was first elected that the most likely winner of the presidential election would be the former French Prime Minister Pierre Fillon, who is classified in France as being on the centre-right. But of course, Fillon was unacceptable to large parts of the French establishment and to the European establishment as a whole, because Fillon was an advocate of sanctions, relaxing the sanctions against Russia and changing the policy, France's policy and Europe's policy, with respect to the already existing crisis in Ukraine. And as very often happens in French politics, Fillon was knocked out before the election took place through what was essentially, in my opinion, a political maneuver. A scandal was discovered in terms of his financial affairs, his handling of his office. There is no doubt, by the way, absolutely none whatsoever, that Fillon actually did commit the criminal acts that his opponents accused him of, and that he was indeed guilty of them. Except, of course, that in France, this is a commonplace thing for French political leaders to do, for politicians to do. I have no doubt that everybody knew about what Fillon was doing long before it became an issue. And of course, it was raked up at the time in order to knock him out of contention. And then, out of nowhere, this unknown young politician in his 30s, Emmanuel Macron, was presented to the French people as the person who would transform France, who would carry out the fundamental reforms that France needed. And he was presented to the French people as the outsider who would transform France. Except, of course, that Macron was not an outsider. He was a banker. He'd served in the French government already as a cabinet minister. He'd risen in the classic way in French politics. He was a graduate of the École Nationale d'Administration, which he has basically renamed. He's pretended that he's abolished it, but he's essentially simply renamed it in order to give the impression that he's abolished it. He was a classic insider presented to the French as an outsider. But the whole exercise proved successful. The insider-outsider, the young, charismatic leader, was successful against Marine Le Pen, who, of course, had all the major problems that has beset her throughout her career, the associations with the far right, the identification with Vichy and Pétain, and all of that, which basically held her back. And I would add, by the way, that Le Pen has never been a particularly good campaigner and was a seriously poor campaigner in that presidential election, which Macron, of course, then duly won. But as I said, the point about Macron was that he was elected on a false premise, that he was an outsider who would carry out a root and branch reform of France, whereas in fact he was a consummate insider who was basically brought into the system in order to preserve it whilst carrying out certain reforms, which inevitably, the cost of which were borne by the wider mass of the French people. And the result was a government that became increasingly unpopular and lost its way, and a president who was brought to power through intrigues and who continued with these various intrigues, and who also, as is often the case with people who are elevated to very high positions too early in life, became increasingly vain and excessively sure of himself, and who gradually lost touch, if he ever had it, with the pulse of French life and with the French people. And the result is a government that has just drifted, and which has at times also been aggressive in putting down opposition, and which has loyally followed the line of what might be called the European establishment and the French part of that European establishment as well. And the result is what Greeks referred to as stasis, paralysis, inability to govern, growing malfunction across the political system, and an inability to conduct actual serious policies that the French people might understand and actually support, because they're not going to support decisions or policies that are made for them by an elite which makes little secret of the fact that it has little interest in them and ultimately despises them. So the result has been, to those people who always insist that Macron is the great barrier, has represented the great barrier against Le Pen's victory, if Le Pen's victory is that important that it must be prevented. You often find people say that stopping Le Pen needs to be the overriding priority around which all of French politics should be constructed. I think that is completely wrong myself. But to those people who argue that, well, look at what has actually happened. With every year that has passed, with every election that has taken place in France over the period of Macron's presidency, Le Pen, the National Rally, have got stronger and stronger and have won over more and more of the people of France, to the point that they now stand at the gateway of power. So Macron has failed in everything that he sought to do. He has not transformed the French economy for the better. He has not made it more dynamic. He has not stopped Marine Le Pen and the National Rally in their tracks. He's made them stronger instead. He's made France itself mostly ungovernable, at least at the political level. The administration in France continues to function very efficiently. France has always had a relatively efficient bureaucratic system. The finances, the public finances in France have deteriorated. The budget the budget deficit has grown. None of the problems that Macron was supposed to address have improved. And as happens with leaders who have a very high opinion of themselves, but who are failing in everything else, he is mostly increasingly focused on foreign policy, on European integration, on fanciful ideas of creating European armies, of which, of course, he will be ultimately the eventual commander-in-chief. And, of course, over the last 3 years, he has become one of the major champions of the conflict against Russia in Ukraine. Here, by the way, I ought to say that he's also failed. I remember when he first became president, his big foreign policy idea then was to try to persuade Putin to submit to the European orthodoxies, to basically give up on Donbass and on the Russians in Ukraine, to distance himself from China and all of that. I remember just a few months after Macron was elected, he invited Putin to France and he lectured him. He lectured the president of Russia about Russian history, giving the president of Russia, no less, a lecture about the policies of Peter the Great, who supposedly had chosen to assimilate, to absorb Russia into Europe. A widespread misconception in the West, which of course Macron fully shares, but one which cut no ice with Putin at all. In fact, knowing Putin, having followed him closely even by that time, I could sense in Putin's words over the course of that trip that he was quietly furious. But anyway, Macron has failed in everything that he has done. He is determined to cling on for a further year. France cannot afford another year of Emmanuel Macron, nor can Europe, by the way. And the sooner he finally goes, the better it will be for France, for Europe, for peace in Europe, for everyone. Personally, I do not have the terror of a win by Marine Le Pen that some people do. I far from agree with her on many of her policies. I don't think that many of the things that she will do will be beneficial or good in the end. But at this precise moment in time, it seems to me that she and her party are the only party in France that are in a position to form a stable government, and that is what France needs. A stable government might be able to stabilise the situation, and then of course people can oppose it and argue against it, and proper politics born of political difference, not constant manipulation and intrigue carried out behind the scenes, which is what we've been seeing in France for the last 10 years. Proper politics can finally return. Now, saying this, of course, I have little hope that that will happen. One of the reasons, no doubt, why Macron says to himself that it is important for him to stay is because Marine Le Pen has at various times suggested that a future government, a future National Rally government, would change France's policies with respect to Ukraine. It would pull France out of this disastrous coalition of the willing that Macron has pulled together with Keir Starmer. We would hopefully be hearing no more nonsense about French troops being sent to Ukraine. And of course, this is now what Macron is determined to press forward with. This notwithstanding the fact that 70% of French people, according to the latest opinion poll that I have seen, actually also strongly oppose this idea. But I suspect that Macron, as everything else in France, starts to fall apart around him, will cling on, will have a prime minister who will basically try to hold things together by doing very little or perhaps nothing, even as the underlying economic situation deteriorates. Anyway, Macron will leave domestic politics to whatever hapless individual he does appoint prime minister from this point going forward, and that he will now focus in the remaining year that he has on pushing forward with this project to send French and European troops to Ukraine. He has failed in everything else, so this now is his priority. Of course, that it is a disastrous, a catastrophic idea that can only prolong war in Europe if it is ever put in place, and which could precipitate a far worse disaster if it leads to actual fighting with the Russians, for which, to be clear, Europe is completely unprepared. Well, that, I suspect, doesn't concern Macron in the least. So there it is, perhaps the most disastrous of the European leaders that we have seen in Europe over the last 10 years, Emmanuel Macron, though I suspect that before long we'll find that Friedrich Merz is giving him a very good run for his money. Meanwhile, in Britain, things are deteriorating there as well. Keir Starmer, Macron's partner in the coalition of the willing enterprise, has tried to stabilise the situation by carrying out a massive reshuffle, a reorganisation of his government. For a few short hours, Starmer got even some favourable commentary because of the sweeping nature of the reshuffle. Then the reshuffle ended. People looked at what he had actually done, realised that the reshuffle actually changed nothing. And the sense in Britain is that the British government, the Starmer government, is also crumbling in exactly the same way that Macron's government in France has crumbled. Now, the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, has said that unless the European Union carries out drastic changes, it could collapse entirely within a fairly short time. I believe he said 10 years. Logically, he is right about this. When one looks at the catastrophe, the political catastrophe that is currently playing out in France, one senses that that ought to be so. We are seeing similar process of destabilization in Germany. Wolfgang Munchau, that most astute of European commentators, has written another very fine article on Unheard, the British centre-left magazine, talking about the decay in economic policy making that is playing out across Europe. He points out, for example, that all the funds that people, European governments and the European Union are allocating are being dedicated to rearmament, which is not, by the way, going to happen, and that the program for investment in new technologies that Mario Draghi, the former ECB president, was articulating just a year ago, that's all basically melted away and been forgotten. And he's absolutely right. I don't myself think Draghi's ideas would have been any more effective than any of the other endless plans that the European Union has come up with over the last 20 years to modernize the European economy. Quite the opposite, actually. But Munchau is absolutely correct that if you look at where funding is going to get a sense of the European elite's priorities, then the way they're allocating funding shows that they're focused on prolonging their conflict with Russia. They're not interested, ultimately, in economic or technological change or modernization or improving Europe's underlying economic problems. Munchau is absolutely correct about this. But anyway, logically, therefore, Orban is right. We have a political elite in Europe that is getting everything wrong, that is causing the situation in Europe to get worse and worse, that is becoming increasingly repressive, which is becoming increasingly unpopular, which is losing touch with the general sentiments of the people in all the various different nations of Europe. The problem with Orban's theory that the European Union is heading for collapse is that he perhaps underestimates the one thing that these people are very, very skillful at, which is retaining control. And I have been expecting the whole European project to run out of road for, several years now. And they always seem to find some way to keep it going. So maybe Orban is actually being over-optimistic, if anything, in expecting that this project is going to run out of road anytime soon. But one thing I'm absolutely sure, that the longer this continues, the more damage to the fabric of Europe is being done. We've seen the fabric that Macron has done, the damage that Macron has done to the fabric of France. And frankly, if I have to be honest, I hope Orban is right, because at least if there's a crisis and we can end it now, there'll be at least something left to put together when we come through the crisis and find ourselves on the other side But anyway, there we are. That's all I'm going to say about Macron. I'll no doubt be returning to Starmer as well before long, but that's the situation, it seems to me, that's playing out at the moment in France and ultimately in Europe as well. Just one very last point. Of course, if there is a collapse of Macron and Macronism in France, if he is forced out over the next year, though I can't see myself how it can be done, impeachment being effectively impossible, if a new government is formed in France, which is going to put a stop to the coalition of the willing, then of course that would represent a massive change, and it would perhaps precipitate the crisis in the European system that Orban is talking about. But Macron is determined to stay on, and I expect that the European elites will pull out every stop to prevent that happening. So a turbulent year ahead in France with no good outcome that I can see. And anyway, I suspect that where France is going, Britain will very soon follow. And then Germany too, and Italy as well. Now, all of this is going on, even as the great conflict in Europe, the military conflict in Europe, the biggest conflict that Europe has indeed experienced since the end of the Second World War, continues to play out. And, well, we've had more news or more information, I'm not sure whether it's news, over the last 24 hours, which, taken together, again, strengthens the sense that we are coming very fast in the military conflict to a point of crisis. In my program yesterday, I pointed out that we now had conclusive evidence that the strike on the bridge in Kremenchuk that crosses the Dnieper, was not accidental, that the Russians did indeed target the bridge, that 11 Duran drones struck the bridge, and that this put the fact that the bridge was deliberately attacked beyond all possible doubt. Now, on the same day that the bridge was struck, during the massive drone and missile raid that took place across Ukraine, the one in which the Russians launched 810 Duran drones and also launched ballistic missiles, there was also a hit on the government building in Kiev, the building on Maidan Square, where the Ukrainian cabinet meets, and which is, in effect, Ukraine's government headquarters, the headquarters of Ukraine's civilian government. Now, there was much speculation about whether this was a deliberate attack or an accidental one. The Ukrainian Prime Minister, Mrs. Sidorenko, insisted that it was a deliberate attack by the Russians on the building that houses the Ukrainian government. The mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, an opponent of Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky. Anyway, Klitschko said that it was a drone that went off course after being hit by Ukrainian air defense, and the hit was, in other words, unintentional and something of an accident. And further reports to that effect appeared on various Ukrainian media sites. Well, over the course of the last 24 hours, an entirely different account of this strike has started to appear in the Ukrainian media. Allegedly, according to this account, the attack was not carried out by a drone at all. The hit was not carried out by a drone at all. Rather, it was a cruise missile launched by Russia's Iskander ballistic missiles. Now, I should explain that the Iskander is itself a ballistic missile. It comes with many different warheads. One of these warheads actually consists of a cluster of, I believe, 3 cruise missiles, which, after they separate from the ballistic missile, the Iskander missile, which has launched them, continue on a maneuverable trajectory towards the designated target. And the claim is that it was one of these cruise missiles that struck the building, the government building, except that the warhead supposedly didn't explode, so that the damage was done exclusively by fuel from the rocket engine, burning fuel from the rocket engine, which explains the limited extent of the damage. Now, if this is correct, then again, we are definitely looking, it seems to me, at an intentional strike. And it would be very alarming to the Ukrainians if this was the case, because, of course, the government center in central Kiev is particularly well defended by Ukrainian air defenses, Patriot missiles at the Zhulenny airport, but also point defense systems. And it would mean that a cruise missile launched by one of these Iskander missiles penetrated this air defense shield, struck the government building, and that it was an intentional attack, and the only reason why more damage was not done was because the warhead itself suffered some kind of malfunction and didn't explode. Now, not only would that suggest a critical weakness in the air defense system in central Kiev, an alarming failure of the air defense system in central Kiev, but it would also suggest that the Russians did indeed launch this strike purposefully. But it would go beyond that, because if you are launching a cruise missile at a building, even one of these very strong, monumental Stalin-era buildings that the government building in Kiev is, even if you do launch a cruise missile against a building like that, then your objective appears to be to destroy the building. I would have thought that a cruise missile strike on a building of that kind, a cruise missile strike, if the warhead had exploded, would have caused immense damage. Now, I don't know that this is so. Arestovich, Zelensky's spin doctor, former spin doctor, who is now a dissident, casts doubt on the whole story. He says that if it was a cruise missile, even if the warhead didn't explode, even if it was just rocket fuel that burned, the damage done to the building would have been far more extensive than it was. And well, he may very well be right. I am not an expert in these matters. But the possibility, at least, is now out there that this was an intentional attack on a decision-making center in Kiev. The air defense in central Kiev failed, and collectively that is going to cause growing alarm amongst the political and military and intelligence leadership in Ukraine, they may start worrying from this point on that the Russians are indeed now finally coming after them. Now, there's a number of further things to say about all of this, and this relates now to the failure of Ukraine's air defences. A couple of days ago, the Ukrainians confirmed that the chief engineer of Kiev's Patriot missile batteries had been killed in a Russian missile strike, which appears to me to confirm that the Russians have indeed managed to inflict successful destruction of Patriot missile batteries in the airport near Kiev itself. And perhaps not coincidentally, there is an article today in the Financial Times which speaks again about the critical shortages Ukraine is facing in terms of its air defenses. The article speaks of reduced deliveries of air defense missiles from the United States. It speaks about how Ukraine is buying air defense missiles from private contractors, but these come only in batches. And Ukraine is trying to source more air defense missiles in Europe, but these are not available to the same degree that the American deliveries once were. The article, by the way, in the Financial Times is another case study in unreality. It mentions just at one point that Elbridge Colby, the US Assistant Secretary for War, as he now must be called, is worried about the depletion of American air defense missile arsenals. But it doesn't explore that question at all. It doesn't discuss production numbers for air defense missiles systems in the United States and in Europe. It gives the impression that this is all somehow the result, these critical shortages that the Ukrainians are facing in air defense missiles is entirely due to Donald Trump and Elbridge Colby and people in the United States ultimately unwilling to supply Ukraine with the air defense missiles that it needs. The simple reality is that the United States is not able to keep up with demands for air defense missiles. Demands from its own military, demands from Ukraine, demands from its ally Israel, which is now in fact involved in a conflict with Iran, and of course demands from other American allies around the world. The Americans, about a year ago, ran out of missiles, and there is no way round this problem. Production of air defense missiles undoubtedly over time will grow, but will never grow to the level where it can meet Ukraine's needs, especially given the increasing power of the Russian missile strikes and drone strikes on Ukraine. It is impossible. So this is the reality that Ukraine faces. It is also the case that the air defense missiles that Ukraine possesses, the Patriots, the most advanced are the Patriots, simply are not designed to deal with the kind of hypersonic missiles that Russia is deploying in growing numbers and using in growing numbers. There will always be an argument about whether Patriot missiles can succeed in shooting down Kinjal hypersonic missiles. I accept it is a theoretical possibility, but everyone who I know acknowledges that in order for that to happen, Patriot missiles must be launched in barrages, depleting numbers at rapid speed, because this is not ultimately what they're designed to do. And there is no conceivable way that Patriot missiles could be used to intercept Oreshnik missiles if the Russians were ever to decide to use them. And I've read that they would probably not be effective against the Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles that the Russians have launched against Ukrainian targets on occasions as well. So Ukraine's air defense problem is simply going to go on getting worse and worse. One thing I have noticed is that, yes, it is correct that the Russians this year launch fewer cruise missiles at Ukraine than they did, say, last year. Obviously, there is a cost calculation here. Why deplete your stockpiles of expensive and cruise missiles that take time to build when you can achieve the same results by launching hundreds of much cheaper Duran drones? Just saying. But I've also noticed that the balance, the mix of Russian missiles launched at Ukraine is changing. The Russians increasingly launch in their missile strikes Iskander ballistic missiles, which at times can have achieve hypersonic speeds. And they're also increasingly using Kinjal missiles. In other words, the Russians are using more and more missiles that the Ukrainian air defenses are not really designed to intercept. So fewer missiles may be used, probably because they're more expensive to build, but those that are used are more likely to hit their targets than was the case a year ago. So one can see the problems. And Zelensky and Syrskyi today, but Zelensky yesterday, began to confirm that there had been an attack on a thermal power plant in the big Russian drone and missile strike. There's been reports of energy shortages in the Kiev area over the last 24 hours, apparently the result of this strike. And Zelensky is now making statements that seem to be intended to prepare Ukrainians for a hard winter, a renewed air offensive by the Russians against Ukraine's energy system, which the Ukrainians are going to struggle to counter to an even greater degree than was true in the previous 2 winters when the Russians conducted precisely that kind of offensive against the energy system before. Well, this is all important news. We're getting a further sense of a steady shifting of the balance further and further towards the Russians in the war in the sky. And there is also a growing sense also that the Russians even if there are still question marks about the attack on the government building in Kiev, one gets the sense anyway that the Russians are starting to become more aggressive in the targets that they are choosing. Dnieper bridges, power plants, that kind of thing. The situation on the ground for the Ukrainians also is continuing to deteriorate. Now, I said yesterday that there was a lot of uncertainty about the situation around Pokrovsk, northeast of Pokrovsk. There were lots of claims, including by Syrskyi himself, that the Ukrainians had conducted successful counterattacks in northeastern Pokrovsk, though Syrskyi was relatively vague, actually, about the details. And, well, within a very short time after Syrskyi making those claims, which are not, by the way, supported by any video footage, within a short period of time of that happening, various Ukrainian bloggers and Telegram channels pushed back and started to say that what Syrskyi was saying was untrue, that he was either deceived himself or was lying, and that the situation northeast of Pokrovsk was actually extremely grave. Well, that's the Ukrainians, but there has been now more information about the situation from the Russians. Now, Radovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, very much, as I've said many times, on the nationalist, patriotic side of the Russian political spectrum, very supportive of the Russian army and of the special military operation, but undoubtedly very well informed about the situation on the battlefronts. Anyway, Radovka, a couple of days ago, about 3 or 4 days ago, reported that the Ukrainians were conducting a major counterattack northeast of Pokrovsk, in the area where in August the Russians achieved their breakthrough. Radovka said that the early part of the counterattack was unsuccessful, but that it would take about 3 days to get a sense of its ultimate outcome. Well, those 3 days have passed, and yesterday Radovka wrote a long account of the battles taking place in northeast Pokrovsk, and it is claiming that the Ukrainian attacks have completely failed. In 1 or 2 places, the Ukrainians did manage to advance, but the only effect of that was that their troops became cut off in mini cauldrons as the Russians were able basically to encircle their spearheads. And apparently no important settlements or villages were captured. And according to Radovka, not only has this counterattack failed, but it has weakened significantly Ukrainian defenses in the breakthrough area, that the Ukrainians would have been much better advised, instead of launching this counterattack, to have concentrated on building strong defense lines north of Pokrovsk. But Syrskyi, presumably acting on Zelensky's orders, tried to roll back the Russians, and as a result, the Ukrainian units that were thrown into the battle northeast of Pokrovsk were very badly mauled by the Russians and had been weakened, and these are some of the best brigades Ukraine has, and the result is that the Russians are now in a stronger position in this very same area to undertake further advances in the future. And Radovka continues to claim that the Ukrainian troops who occupied part of the village of Zoloty Kolodias, which is the northern settlement that the Russians captured in their August breakthrough, that the Ukrainian troops who are in that village are now surrounded, and that there are other Ukrainian troops surrounded as well. Now, there is still limited video footage to confirm any of this. Neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians are producing video footage. But I am going to go with Radovka for the simple reason that Radovka has been consistently correct up to now in what it has been saying about the fighting northeast of Pokrovsk. Not only correct, but ahead of all other reporting platforms. Clearly, they are being provided with information about the situation north of Pokrovsk by people who are there on the ground, just saying. And it looks as if the information they're providing is true. Now, we've had more information about the situation in and around Pokrovsk, other areas of Pokrovsk as well. Kimmakovsky, who is an advisor of Denis Pushilin, who is the head of the Russian-backed regional government in Donetsk, Kimmakovsky says that the Russians have advanced north of Udachny, the village to the southwest of Pokrovsk, and have reached and mostly occupied the Pokrovska mine, the biggest coal mine apparently in Ukraine, and the one which produces most of Ukraine's coking coal, the coal that is used in Ukraine's steel plants. Now, not only, of course, is this mine an important industrial asset, but it is immediately south of the E50 road, and it brings the Russians just south of that road in a position where they can stop, in effect, any communication, any supplies moving along that road to Pokrovsk itself. Now, according to Radovka, the Russians still have a presence just outside Grishinya, village to the north of this road. And about a week ago, the chief of the general staff of the Russian army, General Gerasimov, appeared to confirm this. So, one way or the other, it does look as if the Russians are edging very close now to this road, always, of course, assuming that Kimmakovsky's claims are true. But then again, he's generally been reliable, and I have to say I tend to believe what he says. Now, the other area where the Ukrainians have been claiming successful counterattacks is in the area of Novoekonomichny and Mirnograd, except that video footage has now appeared, which appears to show Russian troops in this precise area where the Ukrainians were supposed to have made advances. Radovka says that there was a counterattack in precisely this area, that it was carried out by an over-aggressive and over-ambitious Ukrainian brigade commander, that the counterattack was a disaster, that the brigade that carried out this attack, has been badly damaged. And, well, the video footage appears again to confirm Radovka's account, and it looks as if the Russians are advancing on Mirnograd from the southeast, even as they are pushing towards the E50 road to Pokrovsk west. If all of this information from Kimmakovsky, from Radovka, is true, and some of it at least is backed by video footage, then over the last 24 hours, the situation of the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk has deteriorated significantly. Now, there are also claims that there is a military crisis brewing for the Ukrainians in the Siversk-Liman area. Complicated battles are taking place there, but it looks as if the Russians now have captured all of the villages to the north and east of Liman itself and look poised to launch an attack on the town. And it also is increasingly looking as if the Russians are indeed close to cutting Siversk's remaining supply routes from the west, in effect encircling Siversk and perhaps forcing a Ukrainian retreat from that town. But perhaps the most dramatic news is from Kupiansk. The Ukrainians have accepted, apparently, significant Russian advances, admitted to significant Russian advances in that area. Putting together what the various maps appear to show, it seems to me that the Russians now control central Kupiansk and all of northern Kupiansk. They appear to have reached, again, the railway line that bisects Kupiansk. They still have to cross the railway line, and railway lines are strong defense lines. They are natural defense lines. So the Battle of Kupiansk perhaps has some way to go. But the Ukrainian defenders in southern Kupiansk are also mostly cut off from supplies. And I cannot imagine that this battle can continue for very much longer. Over the course of the next few weeks, I suspect a whole cluster of towns, Kupiansk, Liman, Siversk, probably Pokrovsk, are going to fall. And then probably Konstantinovka will fall as well. I've said this now in several programs. With every day that passes, we get closer to that point. Syrskyi admitted that the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians 3-1. He is in effect saying that the Ukrainian army is down to 200,000 men. That suggests that the combat force is probably down to around 30,000 men altogether, as some Ukrainian commentators have themselves admitted. There are multiple gaps in the front lines. If the fortified barrier that is holding back the Russians falls, then I don't myself see that there is very much that can stop the Russian army pushing further all the way to the Dnieper, and I don't myself see what the Ukrainians can do to prevent that happening. And it could play out at that point very, very fast. Anyway, that's the military situation. Let's now discuss a few other important things. I've been provided with some further clarification about the so-called Memorandum of Understanding that the Russians and the Chinese concluded with respect to the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. There's been a lot of commentary and claims in the West that this Memorandum of Understanding is no more than that. It's just a statement of intent. I've said already that, in my opinion, it is a lot more than that. I have no doubt that the detail, the pricing formula and all of that has already been agreed by the Russians and the Chinese in the various negotiations that have taken place. In his speech in the Far East Forum, Putin said as much. He said that the price formula had been agreed, that it is a commercial secret, but that it is based on oil prices, and it is similar to the formula that previously applied to Gazprom gas exports, Russian gas exports to Europe, though some of the elements are different because oil prices in the Far East are lower than they tend to be in Europe. Anyway, I've received a clarification about this, which is important, and it is from someone who's absolutely in a position to know. This person who is very familiar with business dealings in Russia and involving Russian companies, has pointed out that what the Western media refers to as a memorandum of understanding is called in Russia a protocol, and it is not the same at all as a Western, or at least an American type memorandum of understanding. It is in effect the last part, the last contractual document agreed after all of the other documents have been agreed. It is the document that signals the go-ahead of the project. A protocol, a Russian protocol, which is what Gazprom has just signed, not only has a contractual meaning different from an American-style memorandum of understanding, but it is absolutely binding, and it does definitely mean that this project is going to go ahead. Now, the Financial Times yesterday confirmed that China has decided to open its financial markets to Russian companies, which are now going to be able to float bonds, RMB bonds, on Chinese financial markets in order to carry out financing for projects in China and to some extent in Russia as well. And the Russian news agency Interfax confirmed as much and said that several Russian companies, and they include energy companies, are indeed now interested in moving ahead and floating bonds on Chinese financial markets. So, coming back to what I said in a recent program, it does look as if the Chinese have either sorted out their arrangements to ensure that their economy is proofed against Western sanctions, American sanctions, or that they've just decided that the point has now come where building up a strategic relationship with Russia, in terms of energy especially, is now so important that whatever the Americans do in terms of sanctions, it really doesn't matter. Now, as it happens, yesterday, the BRICS countries did hold their emergency BRICS summit meeting. There's very, very sketchy details about what took place, and as of this time, I am not clear, I'm not sure who the participants were, but I believe that they did include Putin and Xi Jinping, but we'll be getting clarification fairly soon. Anyway, the information that the Russians, at least, are providing suggests that the major discussion between the BRICS states was about sanctions, the threats of sanctions and tariffs from the Western powers, with the intention to sanctions-proof the various BRICS states from any further economic pressure from the West, in order to keep the movement of goods and trade between BRICS countries flowing whatever sanctions pressure it was that the Western countries, the United States in particular, applied. Now, this is important because over the last few hours, there continues to be discussions and reports and claims about the Europeans and the Americans working together on putting together some kind of joint sanctions package, which supposedly is going to target countries that continue to buy Russian oil and energy products. The most important buyer by far of Russian oil and energy products is China. Larry Johnson on Sona 21 has provided an actually extremely interesting chart in which he says that China buys 42% now of Russia's energy exports, mainly crude oil and coal. India buys 21%, mostly crude oil. Turkey buys 11% of Russia's crude oil. It also buys pipeline gas as well. And other countries basically make up the difference. But those three countries, China, India, and Turkey, are the biggest buyers. And India insists that it will continue to buy crude oil from Russia, and China obviously is going to do the same. And as I said already, they're going to continue to ramp up imports of energy products. The Chinese have just signed off on the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. The other point that Larry Johnson makes is that the energy industry in Russia accounts apparently now for around 15% of Russian GDP. And this has been falling. Oil exports, this is again according to Larry Johnson, account for 15% of GDP in 2025. They accounted, in 2020, 19.2% in 2019, 21.1% in 2018. My own understanding is that this is continuing to fall and that it is now closer to 10%, by the way. Whatever happens, the Russians are going to be able to export oil and gas. There will always be some buyers. And if we're talking about the energy industries, the extractive industries taken as a whole, their biggest buyer of all, by the way, is Russia itself. Russia is a major consumer of oil and gas, and a growing one as well, by the way. So, not only do Westerners overestimate the importance of oil exports to the Russian economy, they also overestimate their ability to pressure other countries to scale down that trade. The Russians are going to be able to continue to develop and grow their economy. They have a very, very low debt to GDP ratio, 19%. Their budget is currently running at about 2.3% of GDP, has a budget deficit of about 2.3% of GDP, and that is apparently likely to fall next year. Industry continues to grow rapidly. There has been a reduction in the growth of GDP this year, but it's likely that GDP is going to start growing faster next year as the central bank reduces interest rates and as inflation falls. to repeat again the point I have made, there is no real prospect now, after the Chinese made the decisions that they did, that sanctions can achieve the outcome that the West expects. And as I said, we're moving towards a military crisis in Ukraine. It baffles me still that Westerners, despite all that has happened over the last 3 years, still don't get this. But with Macron and Starmer apparently determined to press on, probably this is what the West is still going to continue to do, even as the situation, the economic and political situation in the West continues to go wrong. Well, anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Apologies if there's some glare. Suddenly the sun has got very bright. But anyway, let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.